The early morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting golden streaks across the modest living room. Antony rolled over on the couch, groaning as the sunlight hit his eyes. His scars ached from old battles, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his heart. He'd been out of the army for 5 years now, and civilian life still didn't fit right. Every day felt like an uphill battle, but there was one thing that grounded him: Shadow. "Morning, buddy," Antony muttered as the German shepherd padded over, tail wagging. Shadow was a war dog, just like Antony was a war man. They'd been through hell together in Kandahar, dodging bullets and chasing insurgents in the blistering heat. Shadow had saved Antony's life more than once, sniffing out explosives before they could do their deadly work. Antony owed him everything. Shadow let out a low whine and nudged Antony's hand with his nose, urging him to get up. Antony chuckled, his voice gravelly from sleep. All right, let's get you fed." The kitchen was small but tidy. Antony scooped kibble into Shadow's bowl and poured himself a cup of black coffee. He leaned against the countertop, watching as his companion devoured his breakfast with gusto. For a moment, the world felt simple, quiet, peaceful, but Antony couldn't ignore the tension that lingered in the air outside his home. He lived in a predominantly white suburb, and as a black man, veteran or not, he often felt like he didn't belong. The sideways glances, the clutching of purses, the whispered comments, they all added up. He'd hoped his service to the country would earn him some respect, but it seemed like the uniform was the only thing people cared about. Without it, he was just another face they didn't trust. Shadow didn't care about any of that, though. To him, Antony was everything: his leader, his partner, and his family. That unwavering loyalty was what kept Antony going. After breakfast, they set out for their morning walk. The neighborhood was quiet, the sidewalks lined with neatly trimmed hedges and pristine lawns. Shadow trotted beside Antony, his leash loose in his hand. They passed a few joggers and dog walkers, some of whom offered polite nods, while others crossed the street to avoid them. Antony didn't care. Shadow was his world, and that was enough. As they turned the corner onto Maple Drive, Shadow's ears perked up. Antony followed his gaze and saw a police cruiser parked a few houses down. 2 officers stood by the car, their eyes scanning the street. Antony felt a familiar twinge of unease. He'd dealt with law enforcement enough to know that things could go south quickly, especially when you looked like him. "Just keep walking," Antony murmured to Shadow, tugging gently on the leash. But Shadow didn't budge. His hackles rose as he let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on the officers. Antony frowned. Shadow was usually calm around strangers, but something about these men had set him on edge. The officers noticed them then. One of them, a burly man with a buzz cut, stepped forward. His name tag read Clark. "Hey, is that your dog?" Clark called out, his tone sharp. The other officer, a wiry man named Dylan, hung back, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered weapon. Antony tightened his grip on the leash. "Yeah, he's mine. Is there a problem?" Clark strode closer, his gaze flicking between Antony and Shadow. "We got a report about a dangerous dog in the area. That wouldn't happen to be him, would it?" Antony's jaw tightened. "Shadow's not dangerous. He's a trained service dog. We're just out for a walk." Dylan stepped forward then, his voice dripping with suspicion. "You mind keeping him back? He looks aggressive." Shadow growled again, baring his teeth. Antony knelt down, placing a hand on the dog's head. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Then to the officers he said, "He's just protective. He won't hurt you unless you give him a reason." Clark's expression hardened. "You need to control your animal, sir." Antony straightened, his temper flaring. "I am controlling him. He's on a leash, and I'm telling you he's not a threat. Now can we go?" But Clark wasn't listening. He exchanged a glance with Dylan, and before Antony could react, Dylan unholstered his weapon. "Don't," Antony started, but it was too late. The crack of the gunshot shattered the morning calm. Shadow yelped and crumpled to the ground, his body convulsing as blood pooled beneath him. Antony froze, his mind racing to process what had just happened. His best friend, his partner, was lying motionless on the pavement. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Antony shouted, dropping to his knees beside Shadow. The officers stood there, their faces blank, as if they'd just swatted a fly. "He was a threat," Clark said flatly. "We were just doing our job." Antony's hands trembled as he cradled Shadow's lifeless body. Rage bubbled up inside him, threatening to consume him. Shadow had survived bombs and bullets only to be gunned down on a quiet suburban street. And for what? A false report? A trigger-happy cop? You'll pay for this, Antony muttered, his voice shaking with fury. You'll both pay. The world blurred around Antony as he sat on the curb, cradling Shadow's lifeless body in his arms. His vision swam with tears, his chest heaving with grief. The officers stood a few feet away, murmuring into their radios, but their voices were drowned out by the roaring in Antony's ears. He couldn't hear anything. He couldn't feel anything except the weight of his closest companion in his arms. Shadow, Antony whispered, his voice barely audible. He ran a trembling hand over the dog's bloodied fur, his fingers coming away sticky and red. Shadow's eyes, once so sharp and full of life, stared blankly at nothing now. The sight shattered something inside Antony, something that had already been fragile since the war. The officers showed no remorse. Clark glanced at Antony with a mixture of impatience and disdain. Sir, we're going to need you to step back. Animal control is on the way. Antony's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. Step back, he growled. You murdered my dog, and you want me to just step back? Calm down, Dylan said, his tone cold and dismissive. We already told you. It was a justified response. He was acting aggressively. Acting aggressively? Antony echoed, his voice rising. He growled. That's what dogs do. He was protecting me, you trigger-happy pieces of... Clark's hand drifted to his taser as he stepped forward. I'm not going to warn you again, sir. Stand down. Antony's fists clenched, his body trembling as adrenaline coursed through him. His instincts screamed at him to fight back, to unleash the fury simmering in his veins. But years of military training told him otherwise. He knew how this would end if he made the wrong move. And Shadow wouldn't want that. With a low, guttural sound of anguish, Antony stood and backed away, his hands raised. You'll pay for this, he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. I don't know how, but you will. The officers ignored him, turning their attention back to the scene. Antony stared at Shadow's body one last time before walking away, his heart breaking with every step. He didn't look back. Antony didn't sleep that night. He sat in the darkened living room, staring at Shadow's empty bed. The silence was deafening, the absence of his companion like a physical wound. Everything in the house reminded him of Shadow. The leash hanging by the door, the half-empty bag of kibble in the kitchen, the chew toy lying forgotten in the corner. Antony felt like he was suffocating under the weight of it all. He tried filing a complaint with the local police department the next morning. He spoke to a stone-faced officer at the front desk, explaining what had happened and demanding accountability. But all he got in return was a hollow apology and a half-hearted assurance that an internal review would be conducted. We've reviewed the body cam footage, the officer said, not even bothering to meet Antony's eyes. The officers acted within protocol. It was an unfortunate situation, but there's nothing else we can do. Nothing else you can do? Antony repeated, his voice tight with disbelief. They killed my dog, my service dog, and you're just going to brush it off like it's nothing? I'm sorry for your loss, sir, but as I said, the officers acted within protocol. If you'd like, you can file a civil complaint. Antony stared at the officer, his fury barely contained. He realized then that he was wasting his breath. They didn't care. None of them cared. Shadow was just another casualty, another statistic, and the men who killed him would face no consequences. Yeah, Antony said, his voice hollow. I'll file a complaint. But he didn't mean it. He knew that no amount of paperwork would bring Shadow back, or hold those men accountable. If he wanted justice, he'd have to take matters into his own hands. That night, Antony sat at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. He stared at the wall, his mind racing. Memories of Shadow flooded his thoughts, running through the desert together, dodging bullets and explosions, the way Shadow had always been there for him when no one else was. Shadow had saved his life countless times, and Antony had failed to save his. I'm sorry, buddy, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. Tears streamed down his face as he clenched his fists. The grief was overwhelming, but beneath it, something else was growing. Something darker. Anger. No, not anger. Rage. The kind of rage that demanded action. Antony wasn't just a grieving man, he was a soldier, a ranger. He'd been trained to fight, to adapt, to overcome. And he wasn't going to let Shadow's death go unanswered. He opened his laptop and began searching. The officers' names, Clark and Dillon, were burned into his memory. It didn't take long to find their profiles on social media. Pictures of them smiling in uniform, posts about their heroic work on the force. It made Antony sick. He dug deeper. Addresses, schedules, habits, everything he could find. He'd learned in the army that knowledge was power, and if he was going to take them down, he needed to know everything about them. Antony leaned back in his chair, his jaw set. The plan was starting to take shape in his mind. It wouldn't be quick, and it wouldn't be easy, but he was going to make them pay, not just for Shadow, but for every injustice they'd gotten away with. "This one's for you, Shadow," he said softly, his voice resolute. "I promise." Antony was no stranger to war. He'd seen the worst of humanity in the deserts of the Middle East, had stared death in the face more times than he could count. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield in a foreign land. This was his home, his neighborhood, and the enemy wore badges instead of uniforms. Still, the mission was clear. He didn't just want revenge, he wanted justice. And justice, he knew, was rarely handed out freely. It had to be taken. The first step was information. Antony spent the next several days gathering everything he could about Clark and Dillon. He followed their movements, observed their routines, and noted the times they patrolled his neighborhood. It turned out they were partners on the night shift, often patrolling the same handful of streets. Antony also combed through public records and social media, piecing together their lives outside the uniform. Clark was a divorced father of two, living alone in a small apartment downtown. Dillon, on the other hand, was newly married, his wife frequently posting pictures of their perfect life on Instagram. Antony's military training kicked in as he analyzed the data. He created mental profiles of each man, assessing their weaknesses, their habits, their vulnerabilities. Clark was sloppy. He often stayed out drinking after his shift ended, leaving his car parked at the same bar until morning. Dillon, in contrast, was meticulous and by the book, but his arrogance made him predictable. He loved showing off, whether it was his shooting skills at the range or his authority on the streets. Antony's next step was preparation. He wasn't planning to kill them. That would be too easy, too final. No, they needed to feel what he felt. They needed to experience loss, to understand the weight of their actions. And above all, they needed to be exposed for what they were, cowards hiding behind a badge. Antony's small garage became his war room. He cleared out the cluttered shelves of old tools and boxes, replacing them with the gear he'd need for his mission. Most of it was non-lethal but capable of inflicting pain and fear, tools designed to incapacitate rather than kill. He started with the basics: smoke bombs and flashbangs, homemade but effective, meant to disorient and confuse. Zip ties for restraint, a tactical knife and baton, close combat weapons in case things got messy, a voice modulator, to disguise his identity if he needed to speak to them face to face. He also purchased a small drone with a mounted camera, using it to scout their homes and monitor their movements undetected. Every detail mattered. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. Antony spent hours training in his backyard, sharpening his skills. He practiced moving silently in the dark, climbing fences and disabling locks. His body, though scarred and slightly worn from years of combat, quickly fell back into its old rhythm. Muscle memory took over, and the soldier in him resurfaced. But this wasn't just about physical preparation. Antony knew he had to get inside their heads. He wanted them to feel the same fear and helplessness he'd felt when Shadow died in his arms. To do that, he needed to strike where it hurt most: their pride, their reputation, their sense of control. The first target was Clark. Antony followed him to the bar he frequented after his shifts. It was a dingy place on the edge of town, the kind of spot where no one asked questions. Clark would stumble out around 2 a.m., reeking of liquor, and take a back alley shortcut to the parking lot. Antony waited in the shadows, his body tense, but his mind calm. He'd done this before, lying in wait for an ambush, timing his moves with precision. As Clark staggered into the alley, Antony struck. He moved like a ghost, slipping behind the officer and clamping a gloved hand over his mouth. Before Clark could react, Antony pressed the baton against his ribs, sending a jolt of pain through his body. "You don't deserve to wear that badge," Antony growled, his voice distorted by the modulator. "You're nothing but a murderer." Clark thrashed, but Antony was stronger. his grip unrelenting. He dragged the officer deeper into the alley away from prying eyes and zip-tied his hands behind his back. Then he pulled out his phone and played a recording. A loop of Shadow's dying yelp. The sound burned into Antony's memory. Clark's face paled as the sound filled the air. "Do you hear that?" Antony demanded, leaning in close. "That's the sound of what you took from me. That's the sound of a life you ended." I didn't mean to," Clark stammered, his voice shaking. "It was protocol." Antony slammed him against the wall, cutting him off. "Don't you dare talk about protocol. That dog saved lives. More lives than you ever will. And you killed him like he was nothing." He left Clark there, bloodied and humiliated, with a warning. This isn't over. Dylan was a tougher target. He was cautious, always aware of his surroundings. But Antony was patient. He waited until Dylan let his guard down. On a Sunday morning, when the officer went to the shooting range alone, Antony watched from a distance as Dylan set up his targets, oblivious to the drone hovering silently above him. With a press of a button, Antony released a small smoke bomb, sending a plume of white smoke billowing across the range. Dylan coughed and stumbled back, reaching for his gun, but Antony was already there. The fight was quick and brutal. Dylan was a trained officer, but Antony was a ranger, a fact that became painfully clear as the two men grappled. Antony disarmed him within seconds, pinning him to the ground. "You like being in control, don't you?" Antony hissed, his voice distorted by the modulator. "You like playing God with people's lives." "Who are you?" Dylan shouted, struggling against Antony's grip. "I'm the man you wronged," Antony said, tightening the zip ties around Dylan's wrists. "I'm the voice of everyone you've ever hurt." He forced Dylan to listen to the same recording of Shadow's yelp, watching as the officer's bravado crumbled. By the time Antony left, Dylan was shaking, his gun shattered on the ground beside him. By the end of the week, both officers were broken, not physically but mentally. Antony had stripped away their confidence, their arrogance, their sense of invincibility. But his mission wasn't complete yet. He wanted the world to see them for what they were. He began compiling evidence. Video recordings, documents, anything that could expose their misconduct. He wasn't just fighting for Shadow anymore. He was fighting for every victim of abuse and injustice who had been silenced. As he stared at the pile of evidence in front of him, Antony felt the faintest flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could turn his pain into something meaningful. But first, there was one final step to his plan. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Antony crouched in the shadows outside the precinct, his heart steady, his breathing controlled. This was the final stage of his mission. His encounters with Clark and Dylan had been personal, a message delivered directly to their souls. Now it was time to expose them for the world to see. Antony had spent the last week preparing for this moment. He had combed through every shred of evidence he could find: body cam footage, citizen complaints, eyewitness accounts, all pointing to Clark and Dylan's history of misconduct. Shadow's death was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a culture of impunity that allowed officers like them to abuse their power without consequence. Antony had uploaded the evidence to a secure server, ready to release it to the public. But that wasn't enough. He needed to make a statement, to shine a spotlight so bright that no one could ignore the truth. And that meant taking the fight directly to Clark and Dylan. Clark was the first to fall into Antony's web. After their encounter in the alley, he had been on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder. But paranoia had its limits, and eventually Clark returned to his usual routine. Antony knew he would. Men like Clark always thought they were untouchable. Antony waited outside the bar where Clark spent his nights, watching as the officer stumbled out around midnight. This time, Clark wasn't alone. Another officer, a younger man with a nervous energy, was helping him to his car. "Come on, man," the younger officer said. "You can't keep doing this. If the captain finds out—" "The captain won't find out," Clark slurred, waving him off. "I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive, kid. Just drive me home." The younger officer hesitated, glancing around the empty parking lot. That was when Antony struck. A flashbang erupted near their feet, filling the air with a blinding light and deafening noise. The younger officer fell to the ground, clutching his ears while Clark staggered back, disoriented. Antony moved quickly, slipping behind Clark and locking an arm around his throat. "Hello again, Officer Clark," he said, his voice low and distorted by the modulator. Clark froze, his body trembling. You, he whispered. What do you want? I want justice, Antony replied, dragging him toward a nearby van. And you're going to help me get it. Dylan's turn came shortly after. Antony intercepted him during his morning jog, ambushing him on a secluded trail. The fight was brief but intense, with Antony's superior training giving him the upper hand. Within minutes, Dylan was zip-tied and blindfolded, his shouts muffled by a gag. Antony transported both officers to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The space was dark and cold, the air heavy with the smell of dust and rust. Antony had set up a small camera in the center of the room, its lens focused on 2 chairs positioned under a single hanging light bulb. Clark and Dylan sat in those chairs now, their hands bound behind their backs, their faces pale with fear. Antony stood before them, his face hidden beneath a black mask. The camera's red light blinked steadily, recording everything. You're probably wondering why you're here, Antony began, his voice calm but laced with menace. Let me make it simple. You killed someone I loved, you abused your power, and you thought you'd get away with it. But not this time. Clark glared at him, his bravado faltering. You're insane. You think this is going to change anything? You're just a vigilante. Nothing you do here will matter. Antony tilted his head, considering the words. Maybe you're right. Maybe this won't matter, but I owe it to Shadow to try. He turned to the camera, his voice steady. To everyone watching this, these men are Officers Clark and Dylan of the local police department. They've been involved in numerous incidents of misconduct, including the killing of my service dog, Shadow. I've gathered evidence of their crimes, and I'm sharing it with the world. It's time for accountability. Antony stepped back, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. Then he turned off the camera, the recording complete. He uploaded the footage to the server, scheduling it to go live in 24 hours. By then, the officers would be found, their reputations in tatters, their careers destroyed. With the broadcast complete, Antony faced the 2 men once more. This is your reckoning, he said. You won't die here, but your lives as you know them are over. Clark's voice cracked as he pleaded. Please, and I have kids, don't do this, don't ruin me. Antony's eyes burned with fury. You didn't think about my family when you killed Shadow. You didn't think about anyone but yourself. Dylan, who had been silent until now, spoke up. We made a mistake. We're sorry. Isn't that enough? Antony leaned in close, his voice a low growl. Sorry doesn't bring Shadow back. Sorry doesn't erase the lives you've ruined. He left them there, bound and helpless, with nothing but their guilt and fear for company. By the time they were found, the world would know the truth. In the days that followed, the video went viral. News outlets picked up the story, and protests erupted in the streets. The police department was forced to open an investigation, and both Clark and Dylan were suspended pending review. Their faces were plastered across every screen, their names dragged through the mud. For the first time in their lives, they felt the weight of accountability. Antony watched it all unfold from the safety of his home. He felt a sense of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the lingering ache in his chest. Shadow was gone, and nothing could change that. Justice had been served, but the emptiness remained. Still, Antony knew he couldn't stop there. Shadow had been more than a dog. He had been a symbol of loyalty, courage, and love. Antony wanted to honor that legacy. He began reaching out to other veterans, sharing his story and offering support. He started a program to help train service dogs for those struggling with PTSD, giving others the chance to experience the bond that had saved him so many times. As he stood in his backyard one evening, gazing at the empty leash that still hung by the door, Antony felt a flicker of peace. Shadow was gone, but his spirit lived on in every life Antony touched. And for the first time since that fateful day, Antony allowed himself to hope. This one's for you, buddy, he whispered to the night sky. I'll make you proud. The morning light spilled through the blinds, illuminating the modest living room that had once felt unbearably empty. Antony sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. The world had taken notice. The video exposing Clark and Dylan spread like wildfire, igniting debates about accountability and justice. Protests had erupted in the streets, and the police department was under scrutiny. Antony didn't expect the system to change overnight, but he knew he had struck a nerve. People were listening, people were paying attention, but even as the world buzzed with activity, Antony found himself drawn inward. The rage that had consumed him after Shadow's death had given way to something else. Grief, yes, but also clarity. His revenge had delivered justice, but it hadn't brought Shadow back. No amount of retribution could fill the void his companion had left behind. Antony glanced at the leash hanging by the door. He could almost hear the soft padding of Shadow's paws on the floor, the low whine that always greeted him in the morning. Shadow had been more than a dog. He had been a lifeline, a reminder that even in the darkest moments there was still love and loyalty to hold on to. Antony knew he couldn't let that legacy end here. In the weeks that followed, Antony threw himself into a new mission. He reached out to other veterans, sharing his story and offering support. With the help of donations and local organizations, he started a program to train service dogs for soldiers struggling with PTSD. Each dog was a second chance for someone who had lost their way, just as Shadow had been for him. Standing in the training yard one afternoon, Antony watched as a young German shepherd bounded across the grass toward its new owner, a Marine who had recently returned from deployment. The smile on the Marine's face was one Antony recognized all too well. It was the look of someone who had found hope again. Antony felt a pang of bittersweet pride. Shadow was gone, but his spirit lived on in every wagging tail, every bond formed between a dog and its handler. Antony had turned his pain into something meaningful, something that could make the world just a little bit brighter. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Antony stood in the quiet yard, his hand resting on the empty leash he still kept in his pocket. He closed his eyes and let the memories of Shadow wash over him, not the pain of losing him, but the joy of having known him. "Thank you, buddy," he murmured softly, "for everything."